Picture this, March 8, 2011. A man logs into Facebook and types out a message that will change everything. I will be arrested today for the murder of my sister. I confessed. We'll get in touch soon. Within hours, British police are knocking on his door. He's extradited across international borders, interrogated for days, and then released. Because he didn't do it. He never killed anyone. So why would someone confess to murdering their own sister? The answer is both heartbreaking and brilliant, and it's the key to solving a crime that had been buried for 16 years. This is the story of Nicole van den Hurk, a 15-year-old girl whose brutal murder went unsolved until her stepbrother made an impossible choice: risk his own freedom to catch her killer. Nicole van den Hurk was born on July 4, 1980, in Erkelenz, Germany. Her early life was complicated from the start. Her mother, Angelica Tegmeyer, was a single parent who initially wasn't even certain who Nicole's biological father was. A blood test eventually confirmed he was a married man from the neighborhood. His name was added to Nicole's birth certificate when she was merely 2 years old. Despite this rocky beginning, Angelica tried to build a stable life for her daughter. She began dating a Dutch man named Ad van den Hurk, and after 2 years together, they married. The small family relocated to the Netherlands, where both Angelica and Nicole adopted Ad's surname. For a brief time, things seemed to settle. But stability proved elusive. By 1989, when Nicole was just 9 years old, the marriage fell apart. What happened next would surprise many. Ad, who was Nicole's stepfather and not her biological parent, fought for and won full custody. Angelica struggled with severe mental health issues. She would lock herself in her room for hours at a time, unable to care for her daughter. The court decided Nicole would be better off with Ad. Nicole grew up in her stepfather's household, eventually gaining a stepmother and step-siblings, including a stepbrother named Andy. The family dynamics were complex, but Nicole seemed to adapt. She attended school, made friends, and lived the life of an ordinary Dutch teenager. Then, in April 1995, tragedy struck again. Angelica Tegmeyer took her own life in Tilburg. Nicole was just 14 years old. The loss of her mother, despite their separation, weighed heavily on the young girl. Friends and family watched her carefully, worried about how she was coping with the grief. But Nicole kept moving forward. By that autumn, she landed a seasonal job at a bakery in the Winsel shopping center. It wasn't much, just a part-time position to earn some pocket money, but it gave her a sense of independence and purpose. She was juggling school, work, and social time like any teenager trying to find her place in the world. By October 1995, Nicole was living with her grandmother in Tongeren, a neighborhood in Eindhoven. She still maintained a good relationship with her father and stepmother, who also lived in the city. Everything seemed normal, routine, safe. And then came October 6, 1995. It was a Friday morning. Nicole left her grandmother's house just after 5 a.m., climbing onto her bicycle for the ride to work. The streets were quiet, the city still waking up. She should have arrived at the bakery by 6 a.m. for her shift. She never made it. When Nicole didn't show up for work, her boss tried calling. No answer. By mid-morning, alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't like Nicole. She was responsible, reliable. Something was wrong. By 6 p.m. that same day, police made their first grim discovery: Nicole's bicycle pulled from the Dommel River near a water treatment plant. The bike told a story, but not the one anyone wanted to hear. This wasn't a runaway. This was something far worse. A special unit of 15 officers was immediately assembled. They scoured the area where the bicycle was found, bringing in fire department divers to search beneath the water's surface. They came up empty. Over the following days, the investigation took on an increasingly frantic quality. Detectives interviewed Nicole's family and friends, mapping out her movements in the weeks before her disappearance. They searched for enemies, for secrets, for any hint of why a 15-year-old girl would vanish on her way to work. They found nothing useful. Then, 3 days after Nicole disappeared, 5 teenagers were arrested for causing violent disturbances on the Vassenveerpad, a bicycle path in the same area where Nicole was last seen. Several of them attended Nicole's school. Coincidence? Police weren't taking chances. A 45-member riot police platoon was deployed to Eckhart Woods, the forested area behind the treatment plant. Aircraft flew overhead, scanning bodies of water for any sign of the missing girl. On the ground, Officers questioned every one of Nicole's classmates, looking for that one crucial piece of information that would break the case open. The investigation grew increasingly desperate and increasingly strange. A psychic reached out to Nicole's father and stepmother, claiming to have information. They followed the tip, leading police to search overflow sewers near the Dommel River. Nothing. On October 17th, 11 days after Nicole's disappearance, police made a final, thorough search of the river. Their conclusion was clear. She wasn't in the water. The next day brought a tantalizing lead. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station. The writer claimed to have seen a suspicious car near the bicycle path on the morning Nicole vanished. They even provided a license plate number. Investigators pursued the tip, but it ultimately led nowhere, dismissed as either mistaken or deliberately misleading. Then, on October 19, 13 days after Nicole disappeared, her backpack was discovered on the side of the road near the Eindhoven Canal. Scent dogs specializing in detecting human remains were brought in. Officers searched on foot and by water. Despite this new clue, the investigation continued to crawl forward at an agonizing pace. On October 24th, a television program aired a segment about Nicole's disappearance, pleading for witnesses to come forward. The response was overwhelming. 80 new tips flooded in. Police were optimistic, believing that roughly half of them were worth investigating. But then, in early November, the investigation took a controversial turn. With no concrete evidence of a crime and no body, investigators began theorizing that Nicole hadn't been abducted at all. Maybe she'd simply run away. The theory wasn't pulled from thin air. A witness claimed to have seen a girl matching Nicole's description at a petrol station in Venlo, a city near the German border, on October 6th, the day she vanished. Maybe, police suggested, Nicole had fled to Germany, where she'd been born. Nicole's father, Ad, rejected this theory outright. But her German grandmother wasn't so sure. She's somewhere of her own free will, she told reporters, where she's happy. They were all grasping at hope, because the alternative, the unthinkable, was too terrible to contemplate. November 22nd, 1995, 6 weeks after Nicole van den Hurk left her grandmother's house. A hiker was walking through the woods between the villages of Lierop and Mierlo when they stumbled upon something that would haunt them forever. The body of a teenage girl, partially concealed in the undergrowth. It was Nicole. The autopsy revealed the full horror of what had happened to her. She'd been beaten savagely, 2 jaw fractures, wounds to her head and fingers. She'd been sexually assaulted. And the cause of death, a fatal stab wound to her ribs that caused massive internal bleeding. Nicole van den Hurk had been raped and murdered. She'd likely been dead for most of the 6 weeks she'd been missing, her body exposed to the elements while hundreds of searchers combed the area, coming tantalizingly close but never quite finding her. On November 28, 1995, approximately 1,000 people attended Nicole's funeral. The community was united in grief and outrage. Someone had done this to a 15-year-old girl, and whoever it was, they were still out there. In January 1996, the investigation team was dramatically scaled back from 15 officers to just 4. Budget constraint, they said. Lack of leads, they said. But in February, the case exploded back into the headlines. A teenage girl from Eindhoven was arrested in Miami, Florida, for drug smuggling. During her interrogation, she made an explosive claim. She knew who murdered Nicole van den Hurk. According to her, she'd been forced into smuggling by an Eindhoven drug gang, the same gang responsible for Nicole's death. Ad van den Hurk knew the girl and believed her story. But police were skeptical. By late March, they announced publicly that they could find no evidence to support her testimony. Her version of events, they said, simply didn't add up. Then came May 22, 1996, and the investigation took its most damaging turn yet. Andy van den Hurk, Nicole's stepbrother, was arrested on suspicion of involvement in her murder. Andy was 21 at the time, and by his own admission, he was a mess. He'd been drinking heavily since Nicole disappeared, trying to numb the pain. He'd fallen in with a bad crowd and was refusing to cooperate with investigators. From the outside, he looked like a viable suspect. He was interrogated for 5 days before being released. There was no evidence against him, nothing physical, nothing circumstantial, just police suspicion and a young man who was handling his grief poorly. But the damage was done. 2 weeks later, on June 7th, police arrested Nicole's father, Ad. Same story, 6 days of detention, no evidence, eventual release. For the van den Hurk family, it was the ultimate betrayal. Not only had they lost Nicole, but now they were being publicly accused of hiding something, perhaps even of committing the murder themselves. At first, I had tried to maintain a dark sense of humor about it. I thought, I'm more famous than the average Dutch person, he later recalled. Maybe I'll use that to let everyone know my child is still missing. Maybe someone will recognize her story. But by 2005, a decade after Nicole's murder, Ad's patience had evaporated. It's 100% their fault that it hasn't been solved, he told the Eindhoven daily newspaper. They had an accountant looking for clues. I went into the woods at night with a flashlight. The police only focused on my family and me. Meanwhile, whoever did it could just laugh and erase all traces. The accusation stung, because it was largely true. The initial investigation had been poorly handled, fixating on the family while the real killer remained free. By 2005, the family had scattered. Andy had cleaned up his life and moved to Stevenage, England, where he was working and trying to build a future. Ad had relocated to Benidorm, Spain. His burgeoning music career and his relationship with his wife Yolanda, both casualties of the trauma surrounding Nicole's death. For 15 years, Nicole's case lay dormant, officially open, but functionally abandoned. In 2004, a cold case team had briefly reviewed the file. They found no new angles of investigation and closed it again. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. Andy van den Hurk hadn't forgotten his stepsister. While he'd built a new life in England, Nicole's murder still haunted him. He thought about it constantly, the unanswered questions, the killer who'd gotten away with it, the fact that Nicole's body had been lying in the ground for 16 years with DNA evidence that had never been properly tested. Because that was the thing. In 1995, DNA technology existed, but it was primitive compared to what was available by 2011. Andy knew that if Nicole's body could be exhumed, modern forensic techniques might finally identify her killer. But there was a problem. Dutch authorities had no interest in reopening a case that had been closed for 7 years. There was no new evidence, no new witnesses. As far as they were concerned, Nicole's murder would remain in the unsolved file forever, unless something dramatic happened to force their hand. March 8, 2011. Andy sat down at his computer in Stevenage, England, and logged into Facebook. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. What he was about to do could destroy his life. If it went wrong, and there were so many ways it could go wrong, he could end up spending the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But Nicole deserved justice, and this was the only way. He typed, "I will be arrested today for the murder of my sister. I confessed. We'll get in touch soon." And then he posted it publicly. Within hours, British police arrived at his door. Andy went willingly. He was extradited to the Netherlands on March 30th, and for the next 5 days, Dutch investigators interrogated him relentlessly. They wanted details. How did you kill her? Where did you hide the body? Why did you wait 16 years to confess? Andy stuck to his story. He'd killed Nicole during an attempted robbery on her bicycle route. He'd stabbed her and hidden her body in the woods. It was all planned, all deliberate, and he wanted to confess. But there was a problem. There was no evidence. Nothing physical linked Andy to the crime. No DNA, no witnesses, no motive that made sense. The Facebook post was literally the only piece of evidence against him. After 5 days, the Dutch authorities had no choice. They released him. And that's when Andy revealed the truth. He later explained his thinking in interviews. "I wanted to get her exhumed and get DNA off her. I kind of set myself up, and it could have gone horribly wrong. To get her exhumed, I had to put steps in place. I went to the police and said I did it. She is my sister. Absolutely. I miss her every day." It was an extraordinary gamble, a brother willing to risk a murder conviction to force authorities to take another look at his sister's case. Andy initially claimed he suspected his father, but this appears to have been part of his strategy to create maximum controversy and media attention. And it worked. In September 2011, 16 years after Nicole was laid to rest, her body was exhumed. Forensic technicians from the Netherlands Forensic Institute used cutting-edge techniques that hadn't existed in 1995 to carefully extract DNA samples from her remains and clothing. Within a week, police made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Eindhoven. Foreign DNA had been found on Nicole's body, and they had a profile. The reward for information about the killer was increased from 25,000 guilders to 15,000 euros. Tips flooded in more than 20 credible leads in just the first few days. The DNA analysis revealed two clear male profiles. One matched Nicole's boyfriend at the time, easily explained and expected, but the other belonged to an unknown male. A detective on the cold case team had a hunch. He remembered a case from September 2000 just 5 miles away in Valkenswaard. A young woman had been dragged from her bicycle and sexually assaulted at knife point. The modus operandi was nearly identical to Nicole's murder. The perpetrator in that case had been convicted in 2001. What if they compared the DNA? January 14, 2014. Nearly 19 years after Nicole's murder, police arrested a 46-year-old man. His name was Jos De G. Dutch privacy laws prohibited the media from revealing his full name. His DNA matched both the biological material and an unidentified hair found on Nicole's body. It was a perfect match, and when investigators dug into Jos De G's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. He had 3 prior rape convictions. In one case, he'd been sentenced to 3 years of preventive detention and compulsory psychiatric treatment. At the time of Nicole's murder, he'd been living near Eindhoven and working as a roofer. His daily routes frequently overlapped with the bicycle path Nicole used between her grandmother's home and her workplace. Even more damning, on the morning of October 6, 1995, Jos De G had left his ex-girlfriend home in a rage after a fight. Frustrated and angry, he'd been driving through Eindhoven at exactly the time Nicole was cycling to work. But the defense had questions. Nicole's body had lain exposed to the elements for 6 weeks before discovery. DNA preservation techniques in 1995 were nowhere near as sophisticated as in 2014. Couldn't the samples have degraded? Couldn't they have been contaminated? Defense attorneys seized on anomalies in the DNA analysis. Some peaks in the genetic profile didn't conclusively match either Jos De G or Nicole's boyfriend. The defense argued this suggested a third person's DNA was present evidence that someone else might have killed Nicole. Forensic experts countered that the irregularities resulted from natural degradation over 2 decades, not from a third contributor. The Dutch Supreme Court would eventually reject the third-party theory entirely, calling it highly unlikely, but the doubt lingered. Prosecutors, worried about securing a conviction, made a strategic decision. They dropped the murder charge. Instead, they would pursue Jos De G for rape and manslaughter. Jos De G maintained his innocence. He'd never met Nicole, he insisted. When confronted with the DNA evidence, his story changed. Perhaps they'd had consensual sex before she disappeared, but he couldn't remember. The prosecution found this absurd. Nicole was 15 years old, in a committed relationship, and had a packed schedule between school and work. When would she have had time for a secret rendezvous with a grown man? The theory made no sense. The trial began on November 2, 2015. 20 years after Nicole's murder, her family finally had their day in court. Prosecutors presented their DNA evidence. Forensic experts testified about the matches, the statistical probabilities, and the near impossibility that the samples came from anyone other than Jos De G. But 2 weeks into the trial, everything ground to a halt. A witness had come forward with an explosive claim. Jos De G had confessed to the murder a decade earlier. The witness, a man who'd been a patient in the same mental institution as Jos De G around 2005, described a chilling conversation. He looked at me with those cold eyes and said he killed a girl, the witness told reporters. De G told me he had sex with a girl, and she laughed about the size of his penis. He killed her because she ridiculed him. A second witness from the same psychiatric facility corroborated parts of the story. Jos De G had told him, "I committed murder and I wasn't arrested for it." The defense immediately attacked the witness's credibility. They were after the €15,000 reward money, the GS attorney argued. These were mental patients with questionable reliability, coming forward only now when there was cash on the table. The trial dragged on through 2016. In March, it was announced that the DNA evidence would be reanalyzed using even newer methods. In April, experts testified that it was 2.28 million times more likely than not that Jos De G was one of the people whose DNA was found on Nicole's body. 2.28 million to 1. On October 12, 2016, the prosecution made their final arguments. They requested 14 years in prison for Jos De G. They didn't believe the consensual sex theory. Nicole had no time for a second relationship, and there was no evidence she'd ever met the defendant before the day she died. November 21st, 2016. 21 years after Nicole Van Den Hurk was murdered, Jos De G faced the verdict. The courtroom was packed. Nicole's father, Ad, was there, along with other family members. Andy, who had sparked this entire investigation with his false confession, waited anxiously for the decision. The verdict was mixed. Jos De G was found guilty of rape, but he was acquitted of manslaughter. The court ruled there was still too much doubt about whether he'd actually killed Nicole or whether a third party might have been involved. The sentence: 5 years in prison. 5 years for brutally raping a 15-year-old girl and leaving her to die in the woods. Family members left the courtroom sobbing. Nicole's father called Jos a monster. "This is not a man, but a terrible creature," Ad told reporters. "He has taken the life of my child." The sentence was shockingly lenient for several reasons. Jos De G had already spent 2 years in custody awaiting trial. He'd been deemed legally insane and had been in a secure psychiatric facility when arrested. The court appeared to take these factors into account. But the prosecution wasn't done. They immediately filed an appeal, challenging both the rape conviction and the manslaughter acquittal. On August 28, 2018, the appeal hearing began. This time, the court took a different view of the evidence. They conducted a thorough re-examination of the forensic findings, including the stab wounds on Nicole's body. Expert testimony indicated the wounds were consistent with a non-premeditated attack using a sharp object like a knife, classic manslaughter, rather than first-degree murder. Combined with the DNA evidence and the confession witnesses, the appeal court concluded there was sufficient proof that Jos De G had caused Nicole's death. In October 2018, the manslaughter acquittal was overturned. Jos De G was sentenced to 12 years in prison for rape and manslaughter. The Supreme Court upheld the sentence in 2020. In June of that year, Jos De G received a 4-month reduction in his sentence due to the lengthy trial process. He would serve approximately 11 years and 8 months total. Andy Van Den Hurk's gambit had worked. His false confession had forced authorities to exhume Nicole's body, leading directly to the arrest and conviction of her killer. He'd risked everything: his freedom, his reputation, his future for his stepsister. But the cost of that decision and the weight of Nicole's murder never left him. Andy struggled with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse in the years following the trial. He dealt with chronic pain. The trauma of losing his sister, combined with the stress of his false confession and the years of investigation, took a terrible toll. On September 2, 2022, just over a year after Jos De G's sentence was finalized, Andy Van Den Hurk was found dead in his home in Ipswich, England. He was 46 years old. An inquest at Suffolk Coroner's Court determined he died from a mixture of prescription drugs and alcohol. His father, Ad, later suggested that Andy's death might not have been entirely straightforward. There were signs of a break-in at his apartment before and after his body was discovered. But ultimately, the official findings stood. Andy had taken his own life. In a tragic irony, Andy had spent 16 years fighting to bring his sister's killer to justice, only to die less than 2 years after that justice was finally achieved. The battle had been won, but the cost was devastating. Nicole Van Den Hurk was just 15 years old when she left her grandmother's house on an ordinary Friday morning in October 1995. She should have had her whole life ahead of her, finishing school, falling in love, building a career, maybe having a family of her own. Instead, she encountered a monster on a bicycle path, and her life was brutally stolen from her. For 16 years, that monster walked free, while Nicole's family suffered in silence, their lives torn apart not just by grief but by unjust suspicion and police incompetence. It took an act of almost reckless courage, a brother willing to confess to murder, to finally unlock the case. Andy Van Den Hurk's false confession was ethically complicated, legally dangerous, and absolutely brilliant. It worked when nothing else had. The justice Nicole received was imperfect. 12 years later, reduced to 11 years and 8 months for rape and manslaughter, hardly seems adequate for the brutal murder of a child. But it was more than the family had for 16 long years. It was an acknowledgement. It was true. It was closure, however incomplete. And it came at a price that shouldn't have been necessary. Andy Van Den Hurk gave everything for his sister, including, ultimately, his own life. Sometimes the path to justice requires impossible sacrifices. Sometimes it takes 16 years and a desperate gambit that could have backfired catastrophically. Sometimes the heroes don't survive to see the full fruits of their victory. But Nicole's killer is behind bars. Her family knows the truth, and her story and Andy's extraordinary dedication to solving it will be remembered. Remember, Nicole's story matters. Andy's sacrifice matters. And if you found this case compelling, please consider sharing it, subscribing to more true crime stories, and leaving your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe, and never stop fighting for justice.